We're going to talk about equine horse feed and supplements. The thing we have to remember with horses, they are primarily fiber digesters. They're grazing animals. They evolved moving around the plains, eating grass, grazing, eating wooded material. So our entire GI tract is set up to handle a high fiber, chewy, very abrasive feedstuff. Now, humans came along 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago and domesticated the horse, as in we captured them. Initially, of course, we did things like eat them and drink their milk, but we discovered that horses were quite useful as beasts of burden and to carry us and to pull chariots and this kind of thing. And when we do that, we eliminate the possibility of the horse to graze as he would have done in his natural state. So we had to substitute other feedstuffs in order to enable the animals to have the energy to do the work we wanted them to do. So the whole science of horse feeding has come about in trying to change what the animals are eating from their natural herbivore, natural grass vegetation, to the vegetables that we have accessible to us, that are available in the human society, which enabled the horse to work. So it's always a balancing act between what the horse evolved to eat and what humans would like the horse to eat. And sometimes we veer one way and sometimes we veer the other. And horses, sometimes they thrive on it and sometimes they don't. So we need to be aware of the natural predisposition of the horse to certain feedstuffs, and then where we can substitute in feedstuffs that we have available to us from our modern agricultural practices. Now, humans have been working horses, as we said, for over 6,000 years. Some of the earliest horse domestication was 6,000 years ago. There are probably some that are older. And it was initially for milk, for meat, and then for pulling carts, and then eventually for riding. The horses were not like the modern day horses. They were smaller, they were tougher, they were more like the wild horses because that's what they were. Over the 6,000 years, we have bred them with specific requirements, with specific talents in mind, and we have changed them. They're no longer the tough little wiry pony that used to be wandering the steppes that the early man captured and utilized. Modern day horses are very different, and anyone who goes to a horse show can say, you look at the class of shires and you look at a class of ponies, and how can these be the same animal? And that is all brought about by modern day breeding. The other thing that we've done with our breeding and our management changes is we have changed what the horse gets to eat and how the horse gets to eat it. But we haven't really changed how the horse digests it. That's still the same as it always was. And our problems arise. Management and feeding that we would like to do does not suit the digestive capabilities of the horses we're working with. And that's one of the things we have to be aware of when we do horse nutrition or horse feeding. So the first thing to bear in mind at all times is that horses are fundamentally fiber digesters. They are the last remnants of what is known as a perissodactylia, which are these single-toed ungulates. We get into the technical difference between the ungulata and the perissodactylia, but the horse and the tapir are what is left. There used to be many other species of equids, and we're now down to 3 or 4. Equus caballus, the modern day horse, Equus asinus, the donkey, Equus, the various zebras, which are members of the horse family, but are not actually horses. They're not horses in the sense that a shire is a horse or an Arabian is a horse. Those two are closely aligned genetically, whereas zebras are quite different. And you can't always cross zebras to horses. They're not the same species. So the humans have been changing horses for a long time, but the thing we have to remember is they are fiber digesters. They need a certain minimum level of fiber in their GI tract pretty much at all times. If you don't have enough fiber in the tract, you run into problems with the mechanics of the tract. The tract does not function as it should because it doesn't have anything to push against to push along the feed and the digester. So the first thing you should always do is think about the fiber source. Now, modern day, we have hay. Now, remember, early horses and early man did not have hay. Hay is an invention of agriculture. They had grass, the grasses that grew, that went through their life cycle according to the time of year, the drought, how much water there was, the sunshine hours. And in the winter, they had what was left of the grass, but they did not necessarily have hay. Horses that were the wild horses, of course, cope with it just fine. They move a lot less in the winter. They ate the old, dirty, old, dead, stemmy grasses that were left over from the spring and the summer. But humans wanted them to work, so we learned how to make grass into hay, and then we stored the hay, in which we then fed to the horses over the winter time when there was no grass, in order to be able to continue to work them. So when we talk about the nutrition of horses, we first of all primarily think of grasses. And there are many kinds of grasses. Horses evolved originally from Eohippus, which was the first of the horses, was a forest dweller. It didn't live on the open plains. It lived on the edges of the forest and in the wooded areas, and they ate leaves off of bushes as well as grass. And you can still see that tendency in modern day horses, who are quite happy to snack out of the hedgerow, sometimes to their detriment because they don't always eat things that are good for them. But horses do eat leaves other than grass. However, the steppe animals, the prairie animals, their primary intake would have been grass. They ate the grass as they moved slowly in groups, we would call herds. And the herds could be as small as 2 or 3 individuals, or they could be as big as 30 or 40 or more. But the herds would move around, growing from one section of the steppe or the plain or the prairie to another, mostly following water, because the grass grew everywhere, but the water was only in certain places, so that the animals had to have water. They would basically go from one water hole to the next. And they would be moving slowly at a walk, grazing as they went. And their intake would be almost entirely fiber. Now along comes humans, and we say, okay, we want to go faster than a walk. We want to trot, canter, gallop, whatever. We want to pull a chariot. We want to fight. We need more energy than they got from just walking and eating the grass. And so we introduced them to the grain feeds, to the byproduct of our cereal agriculture. And the first grain that was fed to horses was barley. Barley, there is some evidence of the Abyssinians who used their horses in chariots for war. The army always gets the first dibs at everything. And they would feed their horses a barley mash the night before a battle in order for them to have extra energy to keep pulling the chariot while the guy was fighting. And then the other grains began to get fed over time from sheer experience. And experience means you feed the grain and the horse doesn't do very well. You learn not to feed that grain anymore. Yeah, a lot of animals would have passed on as a result of bad feeding practices, but the ones that didn't taught the early man which grains could be fed to horses. And the grains that we ended up considering feeding to horses in the European area of the world were oats and barley. Those were the two that horses could digest, utilize, didn't cause too much of a GI tract issue. Wheat was not fed to horses. Wheat has many problems when it's fed to horses, and it almost inevitably ends up with some kind of colic if you feed wheat to horses. You can feed a wheat byproduct, which is wheat bran, that is the outer husk of the wheat seed, but you can't feed the actual flour that you make from the wheat because of the high gluten content and because its tendency to form plugs and the horse's tendency to get colic. So the grains that the Europeans fed were primarily barley and oats. Over in the New World, when horses were taken back to North America by the early settlers, they encountered a grain, originally it was teosinte, that then became what we now call corn. and corn was fed to horses. Corn is a slightly different plant from the oats and barley, and it has some different physiological benefits and problems. But corn was fairly successful as a horse feed, and it was again a high energy source for the horses, but it could only be fed in certain amounts. So the feeding of horses, horse grain, is nearly always some mixture of hay or pasture, hay in the winter, pasture in the summer, and some kind of cereal grain, with or without agricultural byproducts added. There's a tendency for humans to take the good bits out of the agricultural products. We take the flour out of the wheat, we're left with wheat bran and wheat straw, which horses can consume. Thank goodness we take the flour. Oats, we can feed oats to horses whole, clipped, crimped, rolled, treated in various ways, cooked even. We feed barley. Barley is best fed cooked or rolled or micronized because it has a very indigestible seed coat. And then there are all the byproducts of the other plants that we utilize for human nutrition. Sugar beet pulp comes from sugar beets, which are grown for the sugar that they accumulate in the beet. The beet is chopped finely and shredded, boiled. The boiling water pulls the sugar out of the cells, and it's then extracted off, and the sugar is dried out. What's left is the fibrous remains of the beet pulp, and that is a good feed for horses, and it's a very good feed for horses. We do the same thing with apples. We get apples, we crush them, we squeeze them, we get apple juice out of them, and most of the sugar goes out in the juice. What we're left with are the fibrous remains of the apples, known as apple pomace. And in the parts of the world where apples were grown in industrial amounts, there would be a fair amount of pomace available for the horses to eat. We also have the byproducts of soybeans. Now in soybeans, the interesting thing is that soy itself, it's a legume, it's a high protein bean. It cannot be fed raw. It can't be eaten raw. Humans can no more eat raw soy than horses can. But the soybean itself is used to produce a whole range of things that humans consume: tofu, miso, textured vegetable protein, all kinds of stuff. Soy itself, the actual soybeans themselves, are crushed and rolled and cooked, and they can be fed as whole roast soy, or they can have the oil that's in them extracted out into soybean oil, and what's left is a high protein cake that is fed to animals, including horses. This is soybean meal. And we do the same thing with the other oil seeds. Canola, for example, we can have canola meal. We can have peanut meal, where we've taken the peanut oil out. We can have hemp meal, modern day hemp growing. We extract the oil for human use, and what's left is a high protein cake that is given to animals. Almost anything we extract the fat out of can be used, flaxseed meal, and so on. So when you look at modern day horse feeds and feeding, you're always looking at a situation where fundamentally you're feeding grass, either as grazing or as hay. And then you are feeding supplementally extra nutrition in the form of other agricultural byproducts or grains that are blended together and made into a palatable feed for the animals to meet the nutrient requirements that exceed the grass that they be eating. If the grass meets their nutritive requirement, then there is no need for grain. You don't always have to feed grain to horses, only have to feed grain if they need extra nutrition over and above the grass that they're consuming.